Well, welcome to As in Heaven Season 3. My name is Jim Davis. I am your host and pastor of Orlando Grace Church, and I'm joined today by my co-host and dear friend Michael Graham, program director for the Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics and the executive producer of our podcast. And today we have the privilege of being joined by Sam Chan from way down under. Sam received his PhD from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School and is the lead mentor and trainer at the EVQ School of Evangelism, like IQ or EQ, we have EVQ, a ministry of City Bible Forum. He's based in Australia. He is the author of several books, including Evangelism in a Skeptical World and How to Talk About Jesus Without Being That Guy. And in these books, Sam breaks down very helpfully how to share Jesus in both vocational and ministry and everyday settings. Sam speaks at conferences around the world on storytelling, apologetics, and the practice of evangelism in a post-Christian culture. Sam also blogs at espressotheology.com. So man, I just really appreciate you joining us today, especially given the time difference. It's about 2:15 here on the East Coast of the United States. What time is it there?
Well, it's 5 a.m. in Sydney, Australia, but more importantly, in the future. We're coming to you one day in the future. That just spins my head.
That is crazy.
Yeah, it's like time travel, space fiction, all rolled in one. I joke, I can tell you what the stock market is going to do.
Man, well, that would be an interesting investment strategy.
Yeah, totally.
Well, thank you for being here and waking up so early.
No worries. It's a pleasure. It's an honor to be here.
Thanks, man. Well, as many of the listeners know by this point, this season of the podcast, we've been talking about living in a new context in the U.S. that we call the Great Dechurching, as 40 million people who used to regularly attend church don't anymore, which is changing so much, not only about churches, but about the very fabric of our society. We learned in our study that 75% of the people who left didn't leave necessarily with some extremely painful circumstance, but rather many just kind of trailed off. They didn't intend to de-church, but they did for far more casual reasons, which would include they moved, hit the ground running, didn't plug in, got busy doing other things. Attendance was inconvenient. They had other priorities for their time and the money, maybe kids' sports. Of course, COVID contributed to all of that. But many people, they left for highly relational reasons. They left, we've talked about the sociological categories of belief, belong, and behave. And a lot of the departures, and incidentally reasons they would return, really land in this belong category. So in our study, we saw people who left church because they didn't fit within the congregation. They didn't experience much love from the congregation. They disagreed with the politics of the congregation, which made them feel like they didn't belong. They disagreed with the politics of the clergy. Their friends were no longer attending worship services. Then, of course, you have instances of racism and misogyny that would make them feel like they did not belong. Things that they read or observed online and social media, negative experiences they had personally in that church. And what we found in our study, and what has really been reinforced through our own anecdotal pastoral experience, is that many people just simply need us really to relate with them with greater wisdom, understanding them, understanding how we're perceived, understanding their needs and their desires. In our book, The Great Dechurching, with the help of our friend and fellow pastor, Jonathan Perdome, we boil this relational wisdom down to 6 key awarenesses: God awareness, self-awareness, others awareness, awareness of how others experience you, emotional awareness, and then cultural awareness. So we're going to use these 6 key awarenesses kind of to guide our conversation here today. All right, so Sam, the opening paragraph of John Calvin's Institute of Christian Religion begins with this profound insight. He says, nearly all the wisdom that we possess, that is to say, true and sound wisdom, consists of 2 parts: the knowledge of God and of ourselves. So Sam, I was wondering if you could speak to what this famous opening has meant to you personally and how it is critical in how we think about our relational engagement, especially of de-churched persons.
Sure, yeah, I love that. Knowledge of God and knowledge of self. The 2 foundations of just being aware of God ourselves and the world around us? Well, let's break it down. So in terms of knowledge of God, when I was a teenager and a college student in Sydney, Australia, I grew up using an evangelism track called 2 Ways to Live, and it's very popular in Australia, and they promote it in the UK and the USA. And as an evangelism track, it's great, but like all evangelism tracks, it ends up being very one-dimensional. So the God in 2 Ways to Live is he's king, he's judge, he's ruler. And therefore the Christian life in 2 Ways to Live is one where we submit to the king, the judge, the ruler. But there was no language in 2 Ways to Live of God as Father, or Jesus as brother, or Jesus as friend, or God and Jesus as shepherd, and no language of the Spirit. So as a Christian, you end up knowing what it's like to live under God's rule as king, judge, and ruler, but you didn't know how to live under God's love or his peace, or as we're discovering more and more in the Bible, the face language, where God makes his face shine upon you and you feel God's pleasure. So that was the knowledge of God that I grew up with. And also knowledge of self. And I probably still am, but an Eternity magazine in Australia just wrote up this story of mine. So maybe I can send you a link later. But I was that classic firstborn Asian kid in a high achieving Asian family. And so I too was insecure. I was anxious. I was a perfectionist. I had to be a high achiever. I had to be a doctor, so I got into medicine. I had to go to the top university in Sydney. I became a marathon runner, and I burnt out. I burnt out twice, once as a medical doctor, and I burnt out a second time as a seminary professor. So I realized, hey, there's something wrong with me. The context changes, but I'm the problem. So I saw a counselor. That's when I found out I was an angry person. And in the counseling world, there's a great saying that says an angry person is actually a sad person. And I was sad because I was insecure. I was proud. I needed achievements to be someone. But bit by God's grace and mercy, I'm learning to be humble in really knowing who I am, and secure because I can trust in Jesus' achievements, not my own achievements. And so then the payload would be, if I was to meet a de-churched person, first of all, what is their knowledge of God? What God are they de-churching from? Like, are they de-churching from a very one-dimensional God, the God they grew up with, rather than the multi-dimensional God of the Bible, the God who has a face that shines upon them, the God who wishes us shalom, love, and peace? It's fascinating because we grew up with this metaphor where we said God is like that judge, you know, when you have a speeding fine and you rock up before this judge and, oh, wait, suddenly the God is your father and he pulls out his wallet and he pays for you. And we often use that metaphor, but now I push back and say that metaphor only works because the judge is your father. Like, there had to be a relationship. This was no random judge you walked before. And so we've neglected that relational shalom aspect of God. And I remember Graham Cole in his book, God the Peacemaker, he says, you know, shalom is the ultimate umbrella term in terms of salvation blessings. I think John Stott in his book, Cross of Christ, says something like union with God is foundational, justification is central, but the ultimate blessing of salvation is adoption. Again, relational. So maybe they're de-churching from a very one-dimensional God, the God they grew up with in Sunday school. Maybe that's the first thing I could say. And also now, as the less high-achieving, less perfectionist, less anxious person, when someone de-churches, I don't feel threatened. I can be the calm, non-anxious presence that they're looking for. And rather than taking it personally that they're de-churching from the church I attend, I can just hear them properly without being threatened or being judged, and try to give them a proper hearing. Tell me more. So what is it that you're de-churching from?
I love that. In our book, we talk about a posture of quiet, calm curiosity. And I think that's exactly just kind of what you're talking about here. I also think about what Paul writes in Colossians when he says, walk in wisdom towards outsiders, making the best use of the time. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. What would you want to say about like that particular passage of Scripture and how it might encourage us to grow in, particularly in that awareness of others?
I love how wisdom is the key word that pops up in that Colossians passage. So again, for us, not just what's true, not just what's right, not just what's good, but what's the wise thing to say? So how can I be wisely aware of what this other person is going through? And again, it's the church or the gospel tract we grew up with. If we grew up with 2 ways to live, like we did in Sydney, Australia, or maybe if we grew up with the Bridge Life or 4 Spiritual Laws, again, nothing wrong with them. But by being evangelism tracts, they end up being very one-dimensional. And in these tracts, they show us as an individual. If you notice, we are the individual, and there are no other people around us. There are no others in the picture, so we don't know how to relate to other people on the same journey as us. And that's where wisdom comes in. And I love how that Colossians passage says how you ought to answer, not what you ought to say, but how we ought to say it. So there's a posture where we come wisely, again, calm, non-anxious, with what my counselors say, a genuine curiosity in the other person. And so I guess I like to follow the wisdom of Jesus. Jesus always answered with a question. I went to an evangelism conference a few years ago, Amplify at Wheaton, online because of COVID. And almost every speaker was saying that in New Testament studies, they're finding that Jesus was asked about 200 questions. He himself asked 300 questions, but he only directly answered a question 8 times. So he usually answered a question with a question. When they said, should we pay taxes? He said, I don't know. Show me a coin. Whose head do you see in this coin? By what authority do you do these things, Jesus? I don't know. By what authority does John the Baptist do his things? So I've learned to always calmly answer the question. Just only the other week when I was doing my part-time work as a doctor, as an assistant to a surgeon, in the middle of the operation, the surgeon, just making small talk, says, so Sam, because this is when we had the big Pride March in Sydney, Australia, said, so are you going into the Pride March this weekend? And my heart's racing. What do I say? You know, there are nurses listening in. There's an anesthesiologist listening in. What do I say? But then I thought, well, how would Jesus answer this? Jesus would answer the question. So then I said to the surgeon, why? Why do you ask? Are you thinking of going in the Pride March? And then he was able to talk. And then I was able to have a genuine curiosity in why he asked. Another time, a young nurse asked me, so what books should I read? And this nurse was from China. So I had the opportunity to be, I could have mansplained to her and said, okay, these are the top 10 books of the canon of Western literature that you need to read. Instead, I thought, you know what, I'll answer with a question. I asked, why do you ask? And that's when she said, oh, listen, I feel so young. I feel like I don't know enough. I don't fit in. So I was able to say, well, would you like to talk to someone? Because I work for City Bible Forum. We have, there's a woman who actually lives near where you are. She's a lawyer. You could talk with her. You could have a walk with her. Would you like that? And she said, yes. So it's almost finding out the question behind the question. I remember when I too was going through a crisis many years ago, I had to decide whether to stay in full-time medicine as a full-time doctor or make a switch into full-time Christian ministry. And I didn't know what to do, which way to go. And so I lined up 5 wise, mature Christian leaders that I looked up to. And I had a meeting with each one of them individually. But at all the meetings, they monologued. They monologued for about an hour back at me. And I walked away profoundly disappointed. I thought, why am I disappointed? I asked for their advice. They gave me 60 minutes of their advice. But then I realized that, well, they had never asked me anything about me. They actually didn't know anything about me or my situation. And really what I wanted to do was talk out aloud. So all they do was ask me a question. And so I met another friend who was a trained counselor. And I said to him, you know what, I could stay in medicine and I could go to all these conferences all around the world. And he simply responded with the question, you could, couldn't you? And just with that one question, I knew I I didn't want to. There was another time a few years ago, I thought, you know what, I should retrain as a surgeon. I've always wanted to be a surgeon. I've got a chance now to be a surgeon. I've got the networks. I've passed all the exams. So I said to my neighbor, who's not even a Christian, but he's a trained counselor, I said, hey, I think I want to be a surgeon. And he just answered with a question, and why? Why would you want to be a surgeon? And with that question, I knew I actually did not want to be a surgeon. So sometimes the best thing is to answer with a question. And the other thing then is I've deliberately tried to do, people often make polite talk with us. A simple question like, what are your plans for the weekend? Or what are your plans for the rest of the day? And then we simply go on our self-absorbed answer and we tell them our plans for the weekend, the plans for the day, and that's it. But I've learned, no. Always flip it back and say, what are your plans for the weekend? And why is that important for you?
You know, it really makes me think of, you know, my dad used to coach me growing up, and he'd say, make sure you ask more questions than other people are. And my kids, I do that a lot with them now, to the point where they even realize, like I will, I don't know a better way, judge somebody in my first interaction based on, if in a conversation, if they ask no questions. I make assumptions about their awareness and their interest and their curiosity, to the point where my kids will be in a conversation with somebody and they'll say, ooh, I know what that, and now I guess it's not my secret with them anymore, but really there's something that relates to the 20th century here in our apologetic and evangelistic method. It was about what is true. And there is truth. I mean, I'm not denying truth. I'm not questioning truth, but sometimes it's just get the right information in them. We wash our hands of it, and then it's up to God. And we miss so much of who the person is. We miss what's good, what's beautiful about the gospel and the people we're sharing with, we're engaging with. So I really appreciate the way that you said that. So going back to feeling insecure, you're a doctor, a medical doctor. You've got your PhD. You've taught in a seminary. One of the things that a lot of people might not know about me is that it took me about a decade to finish my MDiv. And I went to RTS here in Orlando, and when I started my MDiv, I was on staff with crew. I had one kid. I'd take a class here and there. When I finished, I was pastoring a church. I had 4 kids. I was a full-time student by the end. But having had such, let's say, longevity in the classroom, one of the things that I've seen is the tendency not only for Christians in the pews, but also people who are about to be pastors and in some type of full-time ministry, to have a deficiency in their awareness of how others experience them. Now, let me differentiate. Others' awareness is when we are aware of other people and their stories and experiences. Awareness of how other people are experiencing you is different. It's your ability to accurately read, understand, and comprehend how you are coming across to other people. That's a very different kind of awareness. So I have this one super cringy story in preaching lab years ago. There was a small group of us, and I remember that, well, there was a guy, all good people, but a guy stood up to give a sermon, and it was about 55 minutes, and he read the whole thing. There were no illustrations, and there was a Canadian dude in the class, and at the end, he raised his hand, and the first comment was, "That was the most boring thing I've ever heard." And I'm just feeling the cringe. And then the person who had preached it said, "Well, in my context, it's a small church. They're kind of used to it." And then the Canadian's hand went up again, and he said, "I think I can tell you why your church is small." And I was like, "Oh, this is painful. This whole thing is painful." And here I am thinking Canadians are nice, but I got to see, the lack of awareness. And these are our future leaders that we're sending out. So we can have these Michael Scott moments where, does Michael Scott moment connect in Australia? You're following me?
Follow me, okay.
Oh, totally. Even my youngest boy has just binged on the Office series with Michael Scott. And it's just that painful lack of awareness.
Yes.
Again, it's IQ. We have IQ, but do we have EQ?
Yes. Well, that's my effort at others' awareness, making sure that the metaphor is connecting. But we have these Michael Scott moments where we just aren't reading the room as to how people are experiencing us. So, Sam, I would love to hear any similar stories you have to that end, and on a more serious note, kind of unpack how deficiencies here can really undermine our efforts to love and serve other people.
Oh, for sure. We we all have experienced those moments. For me, I remember once I played guitar in the worship band on a family service, when it's just all kids in front of you and we play very exciting children's songs. And I just got so excited. Apparently, I was just getting faster and faster and faster on my guitar. And the pianist afterwards said to me, Sam, you gained a whole bar by the end of the song. And I guess in my mind, I thought I was the best musician ever. I was rocking the room, but everyone else is reading me as, dude, this guy's just getting faster and faster. But we see this all the time. When I go to karaoke, like most of the times, the person up the front singing is very out of tune. And I'm thinking, do they know they're out of tune? And they probably don't. In their mind, they're thinking they're singing like Taylor Swift or Justin Bieber. But no, you are out of tune. I do a lot of skiing, and I see this all the time. You see someone up front helping their friend or family ski, and they were saying, watch what I do, and they demonstrate. But I can see that, no, dude, you're all wrong. You're skiing all wrong. But obviously in this person's mind's eye, they think they're skiing like a ski instructor. And why can't the other person just copy them? Well, they are, and that's why they look as bad as they do. They are copying you. So just the absolute lack of self-perception that there is in almost every sector of life shows we're just unaware of how other people experience us. And amazing, your story again of that guy going for 50 minutes. What is about 50 minutes? I once spoke at a youth conference where the other preacher was given 20 minutes. This is a youth conference. There's a worship band waiting for you. There's all these, there's a tight schedule. This guy went for 50 minutes. And again, and I said to him afterwards, dude, you went for 50 minutes. He goes, nah. I said, no, it's on video. There's a time you can watch the clock at the end. You went for 50. There's an objective marker there. So I think subjectively, we just experience ourselves differently from how other people objectively experience us. So maybe we have to get out of our own skin first before we can even get into the skin of the other person. And so maybe what we do need are these Canadian people who do stick up their hands and say, dude, you are like this. Because I once taught Sunday school many years ago, and for 2 years in a row, I reckon I was a great Sunday school. I was that rock star, cool Sunday school teacher. But the third year I did it, different class, different dynamics. I could not control the class. So for a whole year, it was miserable. It wasn't fun. My sister once asked, well, do you think the problem could be you? It's how they're perceiving you. And up until then, I thought the problem had been them, the students, but it actually was the way they were perceiving me. So I think we all need that neutral third-party person. And maybe the best thing is, just like you should record yourself singing, you should video yourself preaching, we do need to maybe video ourselves every now and then and get a neutral third party to give us feedback.
That's really good. I mean, and we've been in scenarios. I've pastored a couple churches, but so I want to be more general. But we've seen scenarios where I'll give one more specific. As we got to know certain African American men in our church, in our context, they were communicating consistently that they did not feel safe and understood by the leaders of the church. And this caught the leaders off guard. And so there was just this moment of, in kind of a sweet way, the leaders wanted to understand more. And there was this moment of realization that we're disconnected at this moment. And so it really was a sweet story of growing in how we're perceived and why people didn't feel safe. And I was just really thankful for that little moment with them. So many of these awarenesses, they overlap, and the next one, it overlaps with many of the other ones, but it's emotional awareness. We spend a lot of time in my household talking about this. My wife just finished her master's in counseling, also at RTS, and one of the things that we have talked about on our staff team, our elder session at church these past 3 years is how pretty much every one of us in some way, if we're honest, to some degree, has been emotionally compromised during this COVID season. season and all of the turmoil that it has brought with it. And so if we aren't aware of either our own emotional self-regulation or aware of the emotional state of others, it can severely hinder our ability to minister, especially when we're dealing with people who might have actually really been hurt by the church, by Christians, or by both. So something people might not know about you, well, they say not that you've told us now, but they might not have before you said this, is that you are a medical doctor who still actively practices medicine every week. So can you share with us, both from your perspectives as a medical doctor and a ministry leader, how emotional awareness is critical in this conversation that we're having?
Sure. So when I was a junior full-time doctor, I definitely had zero emotional awareness. And, as doctors, we might have high IQ. We know information, we know facts, we know data, but we have very low EQ. And I think as Christian pastors, we do the same. We've been to seminary. We know information. We know facts. We know data. We know exegesis. We know what the verse means. We've been to church history, but we might not have emotional awareness in the same way I did not as a doctor. I'll give you doctor examples. I remember when I was a junior doctor, again, full-time, working in surgery. I was young. I was single, no family. And this would happen all the time. A young man in his 40s, married with kids, would have a brain bleed or brain tumor. Their life would never be the same again. And you would just simply tell the family, he's had a brain tumor. He'll never be the same again. And you would just walk out. You just wouldn't realize the emotional carnage you've just left in that room. And you wouldn't even see it as your job to be aware. I remember another time, a young driver, 18, had an accident. So we simply said, your leg's permanently damaged. We have to cut it off. We just put him to sleep and amputate his leg. And that was it. Like, we just never saw him again. Again, no emotional awareness. You might have done the right thing. You might have done the only thing, but no emotional awareness. And as ministers, we do the same. We preach on divorce and remarriage. We preach on the embryo, abortion, contraception, fertility. We preach on sex and gender. We preach on the environment. We preach on government. But do we have emotional awareness? I remember one time I preached on sex and marriage to the morning congregation, and they're all families, married with kids. And I preached the same sermon at night to college students, completely different response, because they're coming from contexts of power, imbalance, abuse, violence. And the same sermon was received in a completely different way, again, because of my lack of emotional awareness. And I think for that, we need emotional awareness of ourselves. If we get to know the others, we have to know the same of ourselves. And again, the classic counseling saying, an angry person is actually a sad person on the inside. But that's because we ourselves don't know. We only know two emotions, happy and sad, and maybe anger as a third one, but none of the shades of gray in between. So I remember reading a book by an Australian called Stephen Biddulph. He's a child psychologist. So he said the job of a parent is actually to not just spend time with your children, but to teach them emotional literacy. Are they aware, and can they list all the different emotions that we have? There's sorry, there's surprised, there's thankful, there's sad, as well as happy. And so one of the things I've done as a father is I've introduced the concept of dice prayer to my family whenever we check in with each other. And to give a bigger context is most of us, when we grew up praying, we learned the acronym ACTS, ACTS. So A is acclamation, praise. C is confession. T is thanksgiving. S is supplication, where we ask for something. And my PhD supervisor, Graham Cole, he said, can you see how they've left out L, lament, which is a major category of the Psalms, and even anger, like all those imprecatory Psalms. So we've grown up with one-dimensional prayers again. We've lacked all the full dimensions of emotion that are there in the Bible. So I've told my boys now, we roll a dice, and depending on the number, that's the emotion you get to pray. If you roll a 1, you get to pray a happy praise prayer to God. If you roll a 2, you'll roll an ask prayer. 3 is a sorry prayer. 4 is a thank you prayer. Great. 5 is an angry prayer, and 6 is a sad prayer. And the joke was, for a while, my boys would roll the dice, and 1 was, dear God, we're happy Mum and Dad are going to buy us a Sony PlayStation. 2, we ask you that Mum and Dad buy us a Sony PlayStation. 3, we're sorry they still haven't bought us a Sony PlayStation. 4, we thank you that they will. 5, we're angry they still haven't. And 6, we're sad we still don't have a Sony PlayStation. But I remember telling this to someone, they said, that is a brilliant prayer because, again, you don't want to typecast, but typically the pattern has emerged because of the way we've been socialized maybe, that, again, women don't know how to be angry. So if you give them the permission to pray an angry prayer, that's them being emotionally literate before God. And men don't know how to be sorry. So that gives us permission to say a sorry prayer, not just to God, but in front of our family as well. So having the full emotional literacy. And that's why an angry person is a sad person, because they don't know the shades of grey in between. And maybe what we need are just more of the Psalms, because I'm doing the Bible in 1 year program right now, and it exposes me the full range of passages in the Bible that we just don't know what to do with, so that you get the raw, wild passages in the Bible that you can't tame, and also you get those raw, wild Psalms that you can't tame.
You know, it's interesting you're saying this now. Over the past year, we've introduced more songs of lament into our service, and it's really taken quite a bit of teaching and shepherding, because we've seen some resistance from people not wanting to feel sad. They don't want to sing a sad song, and so just teaching like why this is good that we're in touch with our lament. You know, we can't. Christianity is not just happy clappy. I mean, we need to feel these emotions and be honest about these emotions. And certainly the Bible's honest about those emotions. You know, as you're talking about emotional awareness, I actually don't know who this pastor is. He was a friend of a friend, but a buddy of mine told me about this older pastor who was administering communion. And there was a younger woman, and she was crying, and she declined communion. And I felt like in a moment of great emotional awareness, he leaned into her and he said, "Sweetie, it's for sinners. Take it." And he was very attuned to her emotions. I presume he knew her well enough to know what was going on, but it was just a sweet, emotionally aware gospel moment. I just appreciate that.
I'll just share one other thing, and maybe this is one you can edit out. But I remember as a kid in Sunday school, a guest speaker got up the front and said, when you pray, you clasp your hands. And so you have 5 fingers, and the 5 fingers remind you who you can pray for. So the thumb is number 1. So pray to God, praise God, thank him. The pointy finger, so that's your teachers. So pray for your teachers at school, pray for your pastors or Sunday school teachers at church. The third finger, the middle finger, well, that's the strong finger. So pray for authority, kings, presidents, prime ministers. The fourth finger, the ring finger, well, that's the weak one. When you play piano, that's one with no strength. So pray for weak people, the weak, the poor, the marginalized, the disadvantaged. And 5, the little finger, well, that's you. Pray for yourself last. And that was helpful. But now that I'm doing Bible in 1 year, I think we've missed a category here. Just the other day, I was in Psalm 35. Boy, Psalm 35 is an angry psalm. Like, oh, God, I'm surrounded by enemies. Who are they? How dare they? God, punish them. You know, give them back what they're giving to me. So it's a purely angry psalm. So now I'm teaching thumb, that's God. Pointy finger, that's teachers and your pastors at church. The third, middle finger, well, that's a middle finger prayer to God. That's the angry prayer. God, you know, give it back to these people, these enemies that surround me, which is like 1/3 of the Psalms by David. And 4, well, that's your weak, your poor, your marginalized, your disadvantaged, your fourth finger, and your 5th final finger, where you pray for yourself. So I'm teaching my boys now the middle finger prayer.
I love that. We need the emotional vocabulary, though, in all seriousness, though, you know, because I think when we are, you know, we're whole creatures, we're made in God's image, you know, it's clear that, you know, we serve a God who has a large emotional vocabulary. And all of those things intersect in him in ways that are both reflected in us and knowable and comprehensible. And I say all that with, all the doctrinal things of the impassibility and, whatnot, but we do serve a God who does have a significant emotional vocabulary and who knows what it's also like to be incarnated and live among us and learn and experience all the complexities of, living in a fallen, broken world, and all the things that are down about that and that are hard about that, and not yet, having a redemptive arc, and then the things that are also beautiful and exciting and the already. And so I think that already not yet reality creates tension, and we have to live honestly in light of the tension that we have. And so I think emotional awareness is about, you can't have that quiet, calm curiosity if you don't grow in your ability to sit in tension. We have an elder here at our church who's amazing. Known him for a long time. And one of the things he always reminds us on our elder board is a sign of emotional and spiritual maturity is the ability to handle dissonance. In other words, the ability to sit in tension is a sign of relational and spiritual maturity. And I think there's just a lot to that. And we need these things if we're going to live in increasingly challenging times and in complex times, whether that's, culturally, on the macro scale, or, headlines and these kinds of things, or all the way down to just individual interpersonal relationships and the challenges and wins and losses that come from those things. So last but not least, though, among the 6 awarenesses that we're talking about here is
can
cultural.
I just add to what you just said? Yeah. I remember when I was seeing a counselor, and just incidentally, a young boy, a gorgeous boy, 14, on our street, died a sudden, unexpected death. And the counselor asked me all these questions like, have you visited the family yet? What has your wife, Steph, done? I said, Steph's been amazing. She's been over their place. She's brought meals. Counselor said to me, well, what have you done? I said, I have not gone. And then I said, the other day, Steph pulled out photos of the boy. We looked at them, but I couldn't look at them. And the counselor said, why couldn't you look at the photos? And then after a while, she said, you actually don't know how to be sad. You've grown up in a culture where you're not allowed to be sad. The Asian culture is a very private emotion culture. The Australian culture following the United Kingdom is very private emotion culture. The Christian culture is one where you're always meant to be happy. She said, you actually don't know how to be sad. So your homework this week is to go meet the family and be sad. Don't change the topic. Give them the permission to stay in the sad space and be sad. And so I did that. And then the counselor a week later said, well, how did that feel? And I said, for the first time I felt human, like fully human. So it's almost like we can fully image God when we fully image all the emotions, especially sadness as well. And I remember another church leader once saying that when someone says they're leaving the church or they have a problem with the church because you don't have enough hymns, he said the problem is not that you don't have enough hymns. Or they say you're not Baptist enough. The problem is you're not Baptist. That's not the problem. Or they say, we do too much of this. The leader said that's actually not the problem. Whatever they say is a problem usually is not the problem. And so I remember someone in my small group is complaining, we're not doing enough Bible studies. And you sort of think, we are. How are we not doing enough Bible studies? And you can show them the data. Look on this table. Look how many Bible studies we're doing. But then I realized that's actually not the problem. What are their stated problem is not the problem. Usually it's because they're angry, they're hurt, they're bitter, they're sad. And then you have to give them permission to explore where that's coming from. So one of the best ways is hear to understand. So we hear, obviously say their words back at them, but try to understand, okay, what is the feeling behind the feeling? So just last night, someone texted me, my husband's just had a stroke. And in the past, I would have just put on my doctor hat on, blah, 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 blah. This is what they're going to give him, and this is how long they're giving him in hospital, and then these are the tests they're going to do. But all I did to go was, that's horrible. You must be going through an emotional roller coaster right now. Things are happening too fast, but they're happening too slow at the same time. And she went, that's just it. So it's not just identifying their words, but identifying the situation and the emotion they're going through and speaking it back to them. So giving them also the emotional literacy.
I think that's fabulous. Going back to what you said earlier about just Jesus's posture in his relationship, he always went for the heart, of the conversation. And he often got to the question beneath the question. So many times I think in our interactions, we take people's questions at face value and even assume that they have, the vocabulary that they need to actually voice their heart level questions. And sometimes they don't either. And so sometimes, we have to ask clarifying or, questions, that help get more at the heart, of those things. One kind of pro tip from my limited, pastoral experience is, a lot of times when you're in, whether it's an evangelistic conversation or even in the counseling, in the counseling chair, and you have the responsibility of just kind of leading that conversation. Instinctively now, anytime I hear the answer, I don't know, I just answer with the following response. Well, if you did know, what would you say? And that little like kind of instinctive response has often unlocked a lot more additional conversation. And there's a lot that's going on kind of neurobiologically that's, with that question, because you end up accessing a different part of that person's brain when you put if you did know, what would you say? But I think getting to the question beneath the question, is often important. I think too, just another thread, I think that's noteworthy that I was thinking of when you were talking earlier, was just, when people are voicing their objections, and let's say in this instance, for the purpose of this conversation, it's a dechurched person, and they have strong feelings about something. Well, you might feel differently or think differently than them ideologically about the thing that's been difficult or frustrating or sad or painful or even traumatic. But sometimes I think it's important in our conversations, we can know the difference between an affirming an ideology or a theological position or these different kinds of things, and knowing when we can provide emotional validation for how somebody experienced something difficult. And so I think that's something too, in our conversations, particularly with dechurched persons, that, a lot of times people's emotions can be validated even when there's chasms between kind of where they're standing on something and where you're standing on something positionally, even on important things. And so I was just thinking about that as you were talking about that earlier. Though moving into just kind of, and I think this is also related, to, that emotional awareness. I think this last one goes hand in hand, and that's cultural awareness. And so I've been looking forward to, asking this question. Obviously we kind of talked about a little bit, you growing up in Hong Kong and then moving to Australia at a young age. I'm just fascinated to tell you more, like just to hear more from you about how important cultural awareness is, particularly as it pertains to people who are leaving the church.
Oh, yes. Culture. I have chapters on this, so sorry to mention my books explicitly, but I have one chapter on
Please do.
In Evangelism in a Skeptical World. I have one chapter on this, and it's so important. That chapter became 2 chapters in my most recent book called Topical, Preaching in a Complex World, because culture is everywhere. And the thing is, we all know the Bible has a culture, and that's why whenever we speak on the Bible, we have to interpret the Bible's culture into today's culture. So we say things like, back then a Pharisee was this sort of person. Back then a tax collector was this sort of person. Back then a shepherd was this sort of person. So the Bible has a culture that we have to interpret. our own audience, so the person that we're talking to, maybe even the dechurching person we're talking to, they have their own culture. But what we forget is we ourselves have our own culture. And so just as we can be emotionally unaware of ourselves, we can be unaware of our own culture. So the joke I often tell people is, if you're an Australian and you go to America, the Americans will always say, "Oh, I love your accent." But the next thing they say to you is, "Do I have an accent?" I go, "Oh, the Americans are like a fish in water. They can't hear their own accent." And when I was in the Midwest, everyone in the Midwest says, "Oh, we have the neutral accent." That's why they get their newsreaders to come from blank, fill in Missouri, Oklahoma, Kansas, Illinois. That's why newsreaders come from Illinois, because there's no accent. And I once met a guy from California say the reason they make movies out of Hollywood because the Californian accent is the neutral English accent. The whole world cannot hear an accent. I thought, oh my goodness, this person thinks that the Californian accent is normal, neutral, and normative. And, like, yes, there's an English accent. Yes, there's an Irish accent. Yes, there's a Malaysian accent, but there's no Californian accent. It is just pure English. But we do the same. So that's why we have books that are called Asian theology. We have books that are called African theology. But when Wayne Grudem has a book on theology, it's just called Grudem's theology. It's not Grudem's North American theology, as if it's just theology that drops out of the sky. We do that in preaching. We talk about the Asian homiletic, the African homiletic. But, if Haddon Robinson or Brian Chappell has a book on preaching, it's just called Preaching, not North American preaching, but preaching. And so culture is everywhere. So it affects how we interpret things, how we apply things, and how people perceive us. So I go to Chinese church, and the Chinese-speaking congregations, they're very traditional. I go to the English-speaking traditional, much more Western, and I can see the differences everywhere. In the Chinese congregation, if I was to preach, I have to wear a shirt and tie and a suit because that shows respect for the audience. But if I wore shirt and tie in the English service, that shows a disrespect to the audience. I'm coming across as proud, stuck up, self-righteous. If I wore a T-shirt to preach to the English, well, I'm coming across as one of the people, humble. But if I wore a T-shirt in the Chinese audience, I'm disrespectful to them and God. If we go to a job interview, do we wear the white shirt or the colored shirt? If we were Western, we wear the colored shirt. It shows I'm a free thinker, I'm creative. But in the Chinese context, you wear a white plain shirt because it shows you're a team player. If you wore a colored pattern shirt, it shows, you're an upstart. You think you're better than everyone else. And the whole public-private emotion thing is fascinating. If you're private emotion, it shows you don't need to be emotional. You have the truth. If you're emotional, it shows you're manipulative and you're insecure in what you believe. But, public emotion culture, so if you are sincere, you'd be out there about it. And I think 90% of the worship wars that we had in churches were really a public versus private emotion debate. And so it affects the way we practice theology. But I remember reading David Clark, Knowing God, I think it's called. It's a prolegomena on theology. And he talked about how when we see Jesus meet the woman at the well in John chapter 4, and Jesus says to her, "You've had 5 husbands, and the one you're living with now isn't even your husband." To Western ears, we hear, you've left your husbands 5 times and now you're cohabiting, so you're a law breaker, you're a sinner. But David Clark points out in some Middle Eastern cultures, African cultures, they would hear, you've had 5 men abandon you, leave you. And the man you're with now won't even honor you by marrying you. So there she's the broken one rather than the lawbreaker. She's a sinned against rather than a sinner. And there's nothing in the text to tell us which way it should go. But culture often determines which way we do go. Culture determines how we apply things. Like I joke that when I was in Siberia, every preacher applied every passage as "you must stop drinking alcohol." But then when you go to North America, every preacher, every passage, the application is you need to do more quiet times and give more money to missions. But then in Sydney, Australia, every preacher, every passage the application was you need to give up medicine and go into full-time ministry. So culture gives us these blind spots. And going to a Chinese church, I see it everywhere. So I have this saying that what we think are theological disagreements are not theological. They're usually 90% of the time cultural disagreements. And if we can only be aware, we're all aware of the other person's culture, but are we aware of our own culture? And it's interesting, my parents used to run these marriage enrichment things, and a lot of the marriage enrichment retreats were each partner had to learn the culture they were brought up with, the parents that they had, because they brought that into the marriage and without knowing it. They're like a fish in water. They don't notice the water, or they're like dog owners who don't notice the smell of their own dogs. We all have our culture that we're unaware of. We're aware of the other person's culture, but not our own culture.
I love that. I've heard the fish in water analogy, never the owner of the dog who doesn't recognize the smell in the house. That's a really good analogy. You know, I just can't thank you enough. I mean, the goal of this episode, of course, we could do a whole season on developing these awarenesses, but the goal in this episode here is to create an awareness of these awarenesses. So to repeat, we have God awareness, self-awareness, others awareness, awareness of how others perceive you, emotional awareness, and cultural awareness. And it is our deep belief that growing, especially at church leadership levels, in these awarenesses is going to help us minister to people. It's going to help us close the back doors of the church. And it's actually going to help open the front doors of the church with the people that we're doing ministry to. So I just think you've nailed it and been so helpful for me, and I'm sure for everyone listening. And Sam, just thank you so much.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks, Mike. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, our audience, stay tuned. Next week, we are going to be jumping into the data about the most difficult seasons we'll begin jumping into over the next couple weeks, really, the most difficult seasons to maintain your faith as we look at the transition of children into college and young professional or vocation. And we're going to start in the home, and we're going to be here with David Robbins, who is the president and CEO of Family Life, and his wife Meg, dear friends of mine. And we're going to look at what it looks like to parent in a way that helps to encourage your kids to develop a love for the gospel and for Jesus's church.